I did not cry when my sister's hand cracked across my face and 200 people fell silent before their laughter erupted. I did not drop the champagne flute trembling in my palm or flinch at the cameras rising from jeweled clutches like a jeweled forest of judgment. I chose something harder, revenge, not the cinematic kind, but the kind that makes the room remember your name, the kind that travels faster than a slap, the kind that leaves no bruises but moves through a city like electricity. My name is Vivian Morrison, 32, founding partner of a small Manhattan firm that people hire when their fortunes or reputations are on fire. I grew up the second daughter in a family that viewed ambition as unseemly on a girl, unless it could be leveraged for someone prettier. Sabrina auburn hair, green eyes. A talent for drifting into spotlight she did not build was always the headline. I was the end notes. She explored her options through her 20s while I studied case law until my eyes throbbed, took overtime research shifts that bled past midnight, and learned to like convenience store coffee that tasted like burnt hope. The first years of my practice were a blur of rented desks and elastic lunches, but the work found its rhythm. A year ago, a brutal, quiet settlement allowed me to buy a penthouse that looks over Central Park. A glass rectangle I filled with books. Quiet. And the kind of sleep that only arrives when you've paid for it with everything. Sabrina met Derek, investment banker. Surgical haircut. Smile like a spreadsheet 8 months before the night everything snapped. They chose the Ritz-Carlton's ballroom, all marble and gold light, for their fairy tale, and their guest list read like a networking app learned to breathe. I wore a black silk dress and the calm of a woman who knows she can leave early. My mother, Diane, found me before the first course, her silver hair lacquered into diplomacy, her navy gown almost certainly chosen because it photographs as authority. My father, Robert, tall, fitted tux, disappointment worn like a family crest, drifted in behind her. We need a little family chat, my mother said, which in our house always meant prepare to lose something you earned. They did not ask about my work, my friends, my health. They had come to discuss my living situation. Sabrina and Derek, they said, were starting a family and needed space. My penthouse, my home was ideal. Trade? Not give up, my mother cooed, because language is the first instrument of theft. Derek's studio in Queens was perfectly adequate for one person, my father added, as if adequacy were charity. Sabrina arrived smiling the smile she reserved for getting her way. We're planning to start trying right away, she said, and when I offered congratulations, she replied, we already have a place picked out. Yours. I could have laughed if anger hadn't settled in with the steadiness of a metronome. I explained the facts I needed my rooms because they were mine. I paid for them with years of work. I was not trading my life for a studio and a pat on the head. Sabrina leaned in with the precision of a surgeon finding a nerve. You don't even use all that space. No boyfriend, no children. What do you need 3 bedrooms for? She had never understood that solitude can be a cathedral. My father raised his voice, the words bouncing across crystal and napery. It was selfish not to help. Selfish not to think of hypothetical grandchildren who deserved a real home. My mother's voice sharpened into the blade. I knew too well. Selfish children don't deserve success. I asked them when, exactly, I had ever been allowed to behave like family. When I studied for the bar and they called me antisocial. When I started my firm and they called me reckless. When I finally succeeded and they said it was luck. Their faces arranged themselves into offended masks. Sabrina flushed, the the triumph she could not hide warming her cheeks. "You're jealous," she said softly enough to sting. "I'm the one getting married. I'm the one who'll give them grandkids. What have you done besides make money?" I told her I had built a life. She laughed and stepped closer, perfume and entitlement flooding the space between us, and said the words she had always believed: "I deserve everything you're hoarding, your respect, your life, your penthouse." The slap came before I could answer. It sounded like glass breaking in a quiet house. For one suspended second, the quartet faltered. Forks hovered, and 200 faces turned toward us with the fever we all pretend we don't recognize as delight. Then came the laughter, first the brittle kind from her bridesmaids. Then the relieved chorus of onlookers, grateful not to be the one absorbing humiliation. I stood there, my cheek burning, the champagne trembling, and realized the room wanted a scene they could retell tomorrow over eggs at 9:00. They wanted the crying woman who runs. I understood then that humiliation had always been their favorite crowd sport. I set the flute on a cocktail table and reached for my phone. My hands were steady. My mother hissed my name. My father warned me to stop embarrassing myself. Sabrina tried to grab the device, but I turned, typed, and pressed send. The action felt unremarkable, but I understood what I had detonated. Across the room, a few faces changed colleagues from the courts, a partner from a firm that never liked me but respected my results, a reporter who had been circling me for weeks, and, near the back, Judge Margaret Chen, who had once said to a packed courtroom that fairness was not kindness but balance. Their attention was oxygen. "What did you do?" Sabrina asked, her voice suddenly young. I met her eyes and gave her the first honest smile of the evening. "I told the truth to people who know what to do with it." The laughter began to thin. Phones came out for a different reason. My screen pulsed with replies: colleagues, journalists, business clients, friends. I did not describe the slap, everyone had seen that, but I detailed the demand that I surrender my home, my mother's declaration that I did not deserve success, my father's insistence that hypothetical children deserved my rooms more than I did. I named the witnesses who mattered, without tagging them: a judge, a reporter, several lawyers. The truth moved on its own legs. Sabrina's face drained of color as the ballroom shifted from amusement to unease. The murmurs were no longer about my humiliation, but about what had been unleashed. My father's jaw tightened, his voice dropping into the dangerous calm that had frightened me as a child. "Delete it," he ordered. "Now." I shook my head. "It's already moving. Once truth leaves your hand, you don't get it back." My mother tried coaxing, but her eyes betrayed panic. "Vivian, this is your sister's wedding. Don't ruin it." I looked directly at Sabrina, her gown pooling like a broken wave across the marble, and said evenly, "She ruined it the moment she struck me." The phones around us buzzed like cicadas in summer. Guests who had laughed now studied their screens with widened eyes, whispers traveling faster than the string quartet could recover its melody. Sabrina hissed. "You're vindictive," but her voice trembled. "No," I said. "I'm finished being your doormat." Derek finally spoke, his smooth voice cracking under strain. "Vivian, maybe we can work something out. We didn't mean for it to get this far." I regarded him almost with pity. "You married into a family you don't understand. You have no idea what you've just signed up for." It was then I revealed what Sabrina feared most: that Judge Margaret Chen had been in attendance, that she had already texted me her disgust, A man from the Times, David Rodriguez, had asked if I wished to comment on how successful women are treated by their families. Sabrina staggered, her mask crumbling as she realized her carefully curated fairy tale was collapsing. She tried to recover, insisting it was just a slap, that I was being dramatic. I lifted my chin. It was assault, witnessed by 200 people, including a judge and a journalist. My phone rang again. This time, it was Amanda Walsh, head of a top reputation management firm, offering her services pro bono. Reputation in New York is currency, and Sabrina's had just been declared bankrupt. Tears streaked her makeup as she whispered apologies. But the words were hollow, meant only to rewind what could not be undone. My father's voice finally softened into defeat. "What do you want?" he asked. I kept my answer simple: to be left alone. To stop being treated like an ATM. To live in my home without demands that I handed over. My mother attempted one last plea, murmuring that we were still family. I looked at her steadily. Family doesn't scream that success is selfish. Family doesn't assault each other at weddings. Family doesn't laugh when one of their own is humiliated. Around us, the guests began to scatter, their excuses thin, their eyes eager to avoid the wreckage. I told them plainly the penthouse was mine. I earned it. If Sabrina wanted space, she could work for it. My father grabbed my arm, desperate. "We can work this out, counseling, mediation, whatever you want." I glanced at his hand until he released me, realizing what a second public contact could mean. "There's nothing to work out," I said. "You chose her over me. You always have." And with that, I walked out, the sound of my heels echoing in the fractured silence. The lobby air was cool against my burning cheek. The night manager asked gently if I was all right, and I answered with the truth disguised as small talk, just family drama. But already I could feel the story rippling outward, beyond the marble, beyond the hotel staff, into the city's bloodstream. Outside, the October air slapped me harder than Sabrina had, but it carried clarity. I walked instead of hailing a cab, my phone vibrating ceaselessly with messages. Friends, colleagues, journalists, some offering support, some requesting quotes. My old mentor, Patricia Winters, sent the most startling message, pride in my refusal to bow. For the first time that night, my eyes blurred not from pain but from gratitude. By the time I reached my penthouse, my doorman Luis's concerned face was another reminder that strangers often knew me better than blood. "You deserve happiness," he said, and I believed him. Upstairs, I poured a glass of wine and studied my reflection in the mirrored elevator-smudged makeup. Hair undone, cheek red. But my eyes were clear, my posture upright. I looked like a woman who had just endured a battle and discovered she could win. I sat in my living room, the city glittering beyond the glass, and scrolled. Someone had captured the slap on video, and it had already gone viral. Thousands of views within hours. Comments raged across the spectrum: outrage, sympathy, solidarity, legal minds, business figures. Even celebrities added their voices. Sabrina's wedding hashtag had been hijacked. Her curated happiness replaced with evidence of cruelty. The power of narrative had shifted. She was no longer the bride, but the villain of a story she had written with her own hand. The calls kept coming. My assistant Jenna warned that reporters from local news, Page 6, even CNN were circling. They wanted to know if I would press charges, if I would sue, if I would comment. I instructed her to draft a simple statement: gratitude for the support. Focus on my clients. No further comment. But I left the door open about legal action. Options are leverage, and leverage is survival. Hunger reminded me I had not eaten, so I ordered Thai food and sat amid the buzz of notifications, realizing that my family had tried to break me but had inadvertently amplified my voice. By midnight, the story had grown beyond gossip. Bloggers discussed gender and family expectations. Therapists analyzed toxic dynamics. Legal experts debated assault statutes. It was no longer just my private humiliation. It had become a public conversation about success, entitlement, and boundaries. Sabrina's Instagram, once a cascade of curated joy, was now a battlefield of angry comments. Her wedding hashtag was used as a punchline, and for the first time in years, I felt not alone, but accompanied by a chorus of voices who understood. The pad thai arrived lukewarm, but I ate it gratefully, watching the city shimmer below my windows. Each bite felt like a tether to normalcy. Even as my phone vibrated with incoming calls from unfamiliar numbers. Some were old friends I hadn't heard from in years, reaching out with solidarity. Others were journalists, hungry for a quote, a soundbite, a headline. Even my college roommate sent a message that she had seen the video on Instagram and wanted me to know how proud she was. The story was no longer a scandal contained within the Ritz-Carlton. It was spilling across New York and beyond, riding hashtags and retweets. Then Judge Margaret Chen called. Her voice was steady, yet tinged with something heavier. "Vivian, I should have intervened," she said. "What I witnessed tonight wasn't just family drama. It was a pattern of abuse, financial, emotional, and finally physical." The word abuse hit me like a gavel. I had never framed my life that way, but hearing it from her carried the weight of law itself. She reminded me that abuse isn't always fists and bruises. Sometimes it's guilt and demands, silence and betrayal. When we hung up, I sat staring at the skyline, realizing that maybe this was what freedom felt like: not easy, not soft, but undeniable. I silenced my phone for a while and allowed the quiet to settle. My thoughts drifted to the years of compromises, of swallowing insults because family is supposed to matter. I remembered eating ramen noodles in a freezing apartment while Sabrina paraded new handbags. I remembered missing holidays to prepare for trials, only to be told I worked too hard and would end up alone. They had never seen me, only what I could provide. Maybe Judge Chen was right. I had mistaken exploitation for love. Around 2 exhaustion pulled me toward bed. Just as I slipped beneath the covers, the building's intercom buzzed. On the monitor, Sabrina stood outside in her wedding gown, mascara streaked, veil tangled, her expression one of desperation. She looked small, broken. "Please," she whispered to the camera. For a flicker of a second, I saw my sister as a child again, running barefoot through our yard. But then memory returned the sting of her slap, her triumphant sneer, the laughter of 200 guests. I switched off the monitor and let silence fall. By morning, the tabloids had splashed it everywhere. Lawyer assaulted at Ritz wedding ran across page 6 with a photo of Sabrina mid-slap. Social media hashtags multiplied: was, wedding slap, family greed, stand with Vivian. The video had traveled far beyond New York. Strangers across the country were weighing in, sharing their own stories of entitled relatives, broken families, and long overdue boundaries. By noon, the story trended on Twitter, and by evening it reached national news. Sabrina's wedding had become a cautionary tale. The fallout was immediate. Sabrina's new mother-in-law rescinded her Christmas invitation. Derek's firm opened an ethics review after clients expressed concern. My parents' country club quietly suspended their membership. The Morrison name, once polished by wealth and networking, now carried the stink of entitlement. All because they had mistaken cruelty for leverage. I hadn't plotted revenge. I had simply held up a mirror and let the world see. Sabrina called days later. Her voice fractured. She begged me to help her repair the damage, promising public apologies, insisting she had only lashed out in emotion. I listened quietly, then told her the truth she couldn't bear. You didn't mean to face consequences, but you meant to humiliate me. You meant to steal what I earned. Now you live with what you chose. She sobbed, pleading that we were still family. But I reminded her family doesn't assault each other, doesn't laugh at one another's pain, doesn't demand sacrifices they're unwilling to make themselves. There was nothing more to say. And when she hung up, I knew we had reached the end. The months that followed confirmed it. Sabrina lost her job at the boutique PR firm when clients withdrew. Derek, unable to weather the storm, separated from her within 6 months. Their marriage, built on appearances and entitlement, collapsed under scrutiny. She moved back with my parents, who themselves found doors closing in their faces at the businesses and clubs they once dominated. Meanwhile, my practice flourished. New clients came not despite the scandal, but because of it. I became known as the lawyer who would not be silenced, who defended her own dignity with the same fierceness she offered her clients. I turned one penthouse bedroom into a home office, the other into a guest room for friends who had become more family than blood. Where Sabrina once sneered that I had no need for 3 bedrooms, I filled them with purpose. My apartment was no longer a prize to be wrestled over, but a sanctuary I had built with my own hands. The silence from my family was strange at first, but over time, it became a gift. I no longer lived under the shadow of their expectations. Instead, I lived by my own choices. Sometimes, late at night, I replayed that slap in my mind, the sting, the laughter, the shame. But what lingered longer was what came after the clarity, the refusal to bend, the strength to finally say no. That sound, once a symbol of my humiliation, had transformed into the punctuation of a sentence I had been writing my whole life. I would no longer be their victim. 6 months passed, and the world I had once tiptoed through now seemed to expand in front of me with unexpected ease. My phone no longer buzzed with the constant demands of my family. Instead, it hummed with opportunities. Law students asked me to mentor them. Clients sought me out precisely because they admired how I had stood firm. Journalists invited me to speak about boundaries, ambition, and the quiet cruelty families can inflict. I hadn't chosen this stage, but once placed upon it, I found my footing. Sabrina, meanwhile, dissolved into the shadows of her own choices. Her marriage with Derek lasted scarcely long enough for the ink on their wedding license to dry. By spring, the ethics review had ruined Derek's professional reputation, and the financial strain of unemployment fractured their fragile union. She returned to our parents' house, stripped of the sheen she had once worn like armor. I heard from distant relatives that the neighborhood whispered about the once proud Morrison family now living in a kind of social exile. The invitations stopped arriving. The club doors no longer swung open. They had been reduced to exactly what they were, without pretense, people who had built their identity on taking from others. For me, the penthouse became not just a home, but a testament. I redecorated slowly, shifting it away from being a prize of achievement into a space of comfort. One bedroom became a study lined with shelves of case files, law journals, and gifts from grateful clients. The other I filled with warmth, a guest room where friends who felt more like family could stay, complete with soft linens and a view of Central Park that still stunned me each dawn. Every time I passed that room, I remembered Sabrina mocking me for having more space than I needed, and I smiled at the irony. What I needed was not less space, but the right people to share it with. The story, though no longer front-page news, lived on as an echo. Whenever a new client came through my office doors, they sometimes glanced at me with a flicker of recognition. "You're the lawyer from the wedding," they would murmur, half embarrassed, half admiring. I would nod and return to business. But inwardly, I knew it was true that night had branded me. But in a way I could carry. It marked me as someone unwilling to bend to injustice, even when it came dressed in a designer gown and carried the name of family. There were moments of doubt, quiet nights when I wondered if I had been too harsh, if perhaps there had been a gentler way to protect myself without destroying them. But then the memory would return, 200 people laughing as I burned beneath humiliation. My parents silent, my sister triumphant. No, I had not destroyed them. They had destroyed themselves. I had simply chosen not to cover their wreckage with silence anymore. The messages from strangers continued for months. Some shared their own stories of entitled siblings, of parents who demanded sacrifices without gratitude, of cousins who turned family into obligation rather than choice. They wrote to say that watching me refuse had given them permission to refuse as well. A woman from Ohio told me she had finally said no when her brother demanded she co-sign his third mortgage. A man from Texas confessed he had cut off contact with a cousin who drained him for money every year. Each story was a reminder my humiliation had become someone else's liberation. In the spring, I was invited to speak at a women's legal conference. Standing at the podium, I gazed at the sea of faces, young attorneys, seasoned partners, students balancing notebooks on their knees. I told them not about my firm's victories, but about the night my sister slapped me and the choice I made afterward. I spoke about how boundaries are not cruelty, but survival, how silence can be more corrosive than conflict, and how success is not selfish if it is earned. When I finished, the applause felt less like praise and more like solidarity. I knew then that my story was no longer just mine. It belonged to anyone who had ever been told to shrink for the sake of someone else's comfort. And yet, for all the vindication, a part of me remained soft when I thought of Sabrina. I wondered if she remembered the girlhood nights we whispered under covers, dreaming of futures. I wondered if she regretted the moment her hand struck me, or if she regretted only the fallout. Regret, however, was no longer my responsibility to carry. I had given enough of my life to the weight of their expectations. My task now was lighter, sharper, to live without apology. By summer, the city's gossip had moved on to fresher scandals. But my life carried the imprint of that night. I worked. I laughed with friends. I walked through Central Park on evenings that smelled of honeysuckle and car exhaust. Sometimes, when I returned home and the elevator doors opened into my penthouse, I would pause to look at the skyline and whisper to myself, "You kept it." Not just the apartment, but the life, the dignity, the self I had built. Autumn returned with a chill in the air. The same crisp bite I had felt the night I walked away from the Ritz-Carlton. A year had nearly passed, and my life had reshaped itself in ways I could not have predicted. My practice thrived, fueled not only by skill, but by the unspoken reputation of someone who could not be bullied. My circle of friends deepened, many of them becoming closer than blood. I traveled when I wanted, worked as fiercely as I pleased, and came home each night to a sanctuary untouched by demands or conditions. Sabrina and my parents remained absent from my world. I learned through distant channels that Derek had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, though everyone knew the real fracture was public disgrace. Sabrina's job was long gone, and she spent most days at my parents' house, the very people who had once declared that selfish children did not deserve success. They now lived the irony of depending on the daughter they had crowned their golden child. My father's business faltered. My mother's social invitations dwindled. They had wanted my penthouse, but instead, they lost their place in the city's circles. Entitlement, I realized, has an expiration date. For me, the penthouse became more than just a home. It became a symbol. Each window pane, each polished floorboard, reminded me of nights I had worked through exhaustion, of risks taken, of independence hard won. When friends visited, they often marveled at the view, but I found myself marveling at the peace, the silence of not waiting for the next demand, the calm of knowing no one could walk in and take what was mine. I had thought revenge would taste sharp, metallic, like justice carved from fury. Instead, it tasted quiet, like breathing after holding your breath for too long. There were moments when I wondered if reconciliation was possible. Family, after all, is a word that carries weight, even when hollow. But each time the thought crept in, I remembered the ballroom, the slap, the laughter, my parents' silence. Family is not the people who share your name. It is the people who show up when you fall. Sabrina and my parents had shown me exactly who they were. I chose to believe them. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the lights scatter across Central Park, my phone buzzed with a message from a young lawyer I had mentored. She thanked me for inspiring her to demand fair treatment at her firm, to stop shrinking herself to fit the expectations of others. I closed my eyes and let the words settle. That, I realized, was the true outcome of that night. Not the social exile of my family, not the viral headlines, not even the courtroom clients who now trusted me more. The real victory was in the ripples, the way one act of defiance became permission for others to stand taller. When I think back now, I no longer dwell on the sting of Sabrina's hand. I remember instead the moment after, when I chose not to cry, not to flee, but to act. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is not anger, not violence, but truth spoken aloud in a room that wishes you silent. They had tried to strip me of dignity, but instead they stripped themselves of illusion. And in the quiet that followed, I found freedom. So here is what I learned, and what I leave with you. Success is not selfish if it is earned with integrity. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are survival. Family is not defined by blood, but by respect. And sometimes, the best revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, but simply to refuse to let them hurt you again. If this story moved you, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to stand up to family for the sake of your own peace?